Läsningens behag är mera själviska än sociala. Vi kan inte förbättra någon annans liv genom att läsa bättre eller djupare. I sista hand läser vi för att stärka vårt själv och lära dess verkliga intressen. Om litteraturkritiken har någon funktion i dessa tider så är det att rikta sig till den ensamme läsaren som läser för sig själv och inte för något föregivet intresse utöver henne själv.
You cannot, even in the closest of friendships or marriages or erotic matters or familial matters or professional matters, you cannot find perpetual companions. You finally return to yourself in the long hours of the night, in the hour of the wolf. You are alone with yourself. You know destitution and isolation of the spirit. And of course, whatever your religious beliefs are or are not, we are finally quite alone. With our realization of the encroachment of mortality, we are all of us going to die. And for me, at least, it is not philosophy or religion that is the authentic preparation for death. It is the deep reading, I repeat, of the best imaginative literature, of Shakespeare, of Dante, of Cervantes.
Harold Bloom är 70 år, med ett långt liv som litteraturkritiker. Mot slutet som ett slags enmanskorståg för läsningen av goda böcker. God litteratur skulle vi säga. Självklart det blir ett himlaliv. Vem är han att säga vad som är god litteratur? Finns det någon som längre kan och någon som längre bryr sig? Ja, Harold Bloom som sagt. Och med stort genomslag, inte minst i USA. I en rad uppmärksammade böcker på senare år om Shakespeares betydelse för vår syn på oss själva, om hur vi bör läsa och varför, och inte minst vilka böcker vi i första hand bör läsa, Harold Blooms egen litterära kanon för västerlandet, har han med ett slags blandning av passion och uppgivenhet redovisat sin kärlek till litteraturen och sin syn på läsningen, den djupa läsningen och vad han egentligen menar med det.
Specific enough, it will involve not necessarily silence, since I frequently, when I'm alone, read out loud to myself, particularly if it's poetry or a drama. But it does involve being solitary, whether indoors or out. It does involve complete concentration. I don't think it's a good idea to be trying to listen to Mozart or Bach or Stravinsky while one is reading Shakespeare or Strindberg, or holding a conversation with one's wife while one reads. It is a deep and committed activity. I should add, lest this begin to sound too strict and too formal an activity, it is, I think, ultimately the most pleasurable of activities, provided that, and this is a formula I frequently invoke from the English poet Shelley, the Romantic poet, in fact, his definition of the reader's sublime, as he called it, was that it involved the reader yielding up easier pleasures for more difficult pleasures. So I would say that it is an intense and solitary activity undertaken in the quest for a more difficult pleasure.
Why should one yield an easy pleasure for a difficult pleasure?
Well, there are, I suppose, erotic equivalents, and there are, in general, surely human equivalents. Frequently we encounter someone who is superficial and whose converse might seem to offer us a kind of immediate pleasure, one that takes no energy of response on our part. But then you encounter, and I don't necessarily mean erotically, I just mean humanly, another human being who is more reticent, more formal, more reserved in terms of yielding up his or her secrets, by which I mean the secrets of temperament, of personality, of character, of world vision. Also, by a difficult pleasure, or a more difficult pleasure, what Shelley, I think, meant, and what I certainly mean, is wisdom. We all know that we are now in what internationally is being called the age of information. Information is very easily available to us. Indeed, we are flooded with information. We need but turn on the World Wide Web. We need only turn on the television set, and information will come pouring out for us. And of course, to some extent, we also do read for information. We read a technical manual, or we read a history because we need and want that information. But imaginative literature, as it was traditionally called, the dramas of Shakespeare and Ibsen and Strindberg and Molière, the poetry of Homer and of Virgil and of Dante, the novel from Cervantes through Proust, the modern short story from, say, Chekhov through a brilliant American writer like Flannery O'Connor or Hemingway. We read these, indeed, in quest for more difficult pleasures, but also because, though the authors are not necessarily invariably wise, they seem to provide access to more wisdom in ourselves than we at first perhaps suspect we have.
If you go to yourself, I guess you started reading early, I understand. What was the first time you discovered the difficult pleasure of reading?
Oh, I was very young. I had grown up speaking and reading Yiddish in the East Bronx. Even though I was born in the United States, I heard no English spoken until I was about 5.5 years old. And I was a very restless reader, even as a very little boy, really a tiny boy. After I had read my way through Yiddish poetry and fiction, I started to teach myself to read English. And I remember when I was very, very young, becoming fascinated by the poetry of the British romantic poet and mystic, I should say English romantic poet and mystic, William Blake.
You never enjoyed the pleasures of easy reading or the easy pleasures of other reading? You started with Blake and with very demanding poetry at a very young age. That's not what one expects of a young child.
Well, I was a rather odd child, I suppose. I was the fifth and last of 5 children in a very poor household, loving but very poor. My father was a garment maker who had emigrated from Odessa. My mother, a housewife who had come from a little shtetl, a little Jewish town on the outskirts of Brest-Litovsk. My 4 older siblings, who were all much older than I was, were very affectionate towards me, but they were not people greatly interested in reading. But I think I sensed, and after a while, my parents sensed that I was a kind of throwback, as in so many East European Jewish families. And eventually I looked into this because I was curious, though my father's father had been a dock worker in Odessa, and my mother's father had been a carpenter there in that shtetl. Both of them, of course, eventually, together with all my uncles and aunts and cousins whom I never met, horribly murdered by the Nazis, or should one say the Germans. There had been learned men and some learned women back in the family. I eventually discovered that there had been Talmudical scholars and Kabbalists and wonder rabbis of the Hasidim, as they were called. And though I have never been normatively religious in temperament, and even at my bar mitzvah quarreled with the Orthodox rabbis because I already had Gnostic or heretical leanings, I was a throwback, clearly. I've come to understand that now that I'm 70 years old. I had, as a little child, a scandalous ability to memorize almost involuntarily as I read. Not through the eye, but through the ear, since I read out loud. And also, I read like a fire in those days. I can still read very quickly, and I can still remember most of what I read, but not the way I could then. It was, a computer could not have done better.
But can one say then that literature, and in this case quite sophisticated literature or good literature, played an immense role in your personal life at a very young age?
I think I had very little other personal life. I was a very shy child, very protected by my mother as her baby. Indeed, my sweetest memory, which must go back to being about 5 or 6 years old, was being in the kitchen on Friday afternoons while my mother was preparing the Sabbath dinner for Friday evening. And she walked about the kitchen in bare feet as she worked, and I sat on the floor in a corner, as I always did, with a whole pile of books, reading them very, very quickly, or if in the case of Blake, rereading and rereading and rereading. And occasionally, as she walked by, she would put her hand on my head, or I would reach out almost absent-mindedly and touch her toes. But if I go on talking like that, I will cry, and that will embarrass everyone.
So many people today discuss the decline of reading, that children don't read as much as they used to do, or that they read things, they play with computers and they do other things. But you obviously are not satisfied with people reading for the sake of reading, but you are very interested in that they should read the great literature. That's, and can you explain why couldn't we start with sort of the easy pleasures, or maybe be content with the easy pleasures? What is it that is hiding behind this?
Wisdom, as I said before, my dear, wisdom. We thirst after wisdom, whether we know it or not, or we ought to thirst after wisdom. Where shall wisdom be found is the ancient biblical and classical question, and it still seems to me germane in every way. But I'm glad you asked me that, because I had the experience recently in a piece published in the Wall Street Journal in New York City on my 70th birthday, July the 11th. I addressed the Pottermania phenomenon of the Harry Potter books, not intending to cause a controversy, but bringing down 400 negative letters on my head and a great deal of controversy. I had read one of them for the first time. I thought it was awful, and still think it is awful.
Why was it awful?
Because it is written in cliches, my dear, dead metaphors. It is very badly written. It is not alive at all, because the characterization is paper thin. Everyone in the book, at least the first one that I read, The Sorcerer's Stone, including the young Harry Potter, is just a name upon a page. It's not the representation of a possible person. That children who otherwise would not read were willing to read this because it was not going to turn them into readers. They were not going to go from there to, say, James Thurber's The 13 Clocks or Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows.
How do you know? How do you know that that won't lead to that? Why
Well, because I started to talk to many of the parents that I know in New Haven and New York of children, and a few of them had gone on, to such books, but most had not.
You might be right, but what I hear against you is that if people, or young men, or young people don't start to read at all, they for sure will never discover anything else. But if they start to read whatever, or almost whatever, they might discover the
Moving
difficult
one's
pleasures.
eyes, forgive me for interrupting you, but moving one's eyes over a page does not in itself necessarily constitute reading. There has got to be some distinction of language, some distinction of thought. I would think more important on the level of writing for children even than on the level of writing for people in later phases of life.
Does it make any difference then to you if a child or a child's parents purchases a video game or a book?
What is a book?
Well, that's what I'm saying. A book. I mean, let's talk about any book.
We are asking ourselves now, what is a book? A book ought to be, in some sense, a challenge for the reader to grow a little clearer, a little wiser, a little more comprehensive, perhaps even a little more gentle, both towards the self and others.
It's a very high demand you, of course, set for reading. Of course, one can say one can read for pure short-term pleasure instead of doing something else. The question, of course, arises how and how do you bring about people, how do you make people take that step towards difficult pleasure, which we are talking about? There is some resistance involved with it. You have to spend time, invest some energy in order to reach that wisdom, or at least that clearer sight which you promise waits.
As you know, my dear, we once had something called education, both in the United States and in Sweden. There were teachers who taught children to read, indeed to memorize, not by rote, but to read so deeply and thoroughly and with love and out loud to themselves and to others, so that they began to possess what they were reading, particularly poems, by memory. And of course, if you possess it by memory, then it enriches you. It is a problem in education. Though, as you imply quite accurately, it's now an almost insuperable problem.
But I mean, you are a great, of course, one of the greatest writer in your world of literature is Shakespeare. Obviously, people didn't. As far, I didn't live at that time, but I imagine people didn't go to watch the plays of Shakespeare to get wiser. Maybe some did, but they went there to, I guess, have a good time.
Shakespeare is the greatest of all entertainers. There's no question about that. And he can be absorbed, whether in the theater or the motion picture house, or I would say ideally alone in the study. He can be absorbed on every possible level of apprehension. It is a perpetual fascination to me that the most accessible of all writers ever, the most entertaining, should also be, in the end, the most profound, inventive, and original. You know, I have noticed in the last few years that there are only a handful of Western writers who will certainly survive the age of the screen or the visual age. Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, quite possibly Ibsen, quite possibly, if he were done more often, Strindberg.
He's done quite often here. But,
He's done quite
yes,
often here. He is a national playwright here. In the United States, he's done with a curious kind of refraction. People don't realize that Eugene O'Neill is a kind of inadequate imitator of Strindberg. I find it difficult to either watch O'Neill's plays or to read them, though I have done both, of course, because they are, to me, transparently weak imitations of Strindberg. But these are the writers who will survive the visual age, because one aspect of them, and it is by no means their strongest aspect, but still one authentic aspect of them is easily adapted to the screen.
So what is it that eventually will turn a work of literature into, as you say, a canonical work, an everlasting work that will outlive the authors and several generations?
I would say two attributes or powers in particular. One is the power to so stamp itself upon the playgoer or reader that memorability becomes absolute, and the characters never abandon one, as Hamlet and Falstaff and Cleopatra in Shakespeare never abandon one, as Peer Gynt and Brand and Hedda Gabler never abandon one, as poor Miss Julie never abandons one.
And they're very human. Very human people. We recognize ourselves.
Yes, we recognize ourselves in them. Turgenev, the great Russian writer, said that in the end, we are all of us either Don Quixote or we are Hamlet. And there is something to be said for that. I suppose I would have added to Turgenev, or we are Sancho Panza.
Exactly, some of us must be Sancho.
Or John Falstaff. Yes.
But this is, of course, an interest. You have in your Western canon basically listed and argued for that certain works are canonical and should be canonical. And some of them are obviously canonical since they are still alive and still are played and still read, and no one would question that. Of course, the question then, it begs the question, is new canonical work now being created that we don't know of? Are the conditions for creating great literature, are they the same? Are they worse? Are they changing? Are we going into a period when no great works will be created anymore?
I am much more worried about readers than I am about writers. History, Western and Eastern world history, shows one that there have been fresh talents and sometimes fresh geniuses in every age whatsoever. There are remarkable writers now alive and at work. The marvelous Portuguese novelist José Saramago, whose remarkable Gospel According to Jesus Christ I've just written an essay on. The question of whether there will be, as Walt Whitman said, great audiences for great writing is another question, and that is the question that concerns me.
There is something in the process of reading that obviously is important to you, which cannot be compensated by any other means of communication. You talk about a solitary activity, you talk about the solitary reader. You also clearly invoke the dirty word in Sweden, at least, it's an elitist kind of activity.
Reading, as I understand it, is profound, deep reading of the very best that ever has been thought and written, is necessarily an elitist activity, and seems to me very different from other modes of elitist activity. It is not like going to the opera or going to the ballet, valuable as those elitist experiences are. I am myself of the perpetual left, personally. I am a sort of anarcho-syndicalist, brought up, as I say, in a working-class family and with no sympathies whatsoever for social elitism of any kind. But one of my favorite moments in modern criticism is in Leon Trotsky's fierce book called Literature and Revolution, where he is giving advice to Russian writers, to Soviet writers, or to Marxist writers throughout the world. And he says, take one book and one book alone as your textbook. Read Dante, study Dante. What you need to know as a revolutionary writer is there waiting for you in Dante. Is that elitism? Or is that wisdom? A dark wisdom, if one happens to feel that Trotsky was a savage. It is, to me, and I'm willing to defend it as such, the most selfish of pleasures. If you wish to call it that, the most elitist of pleasures. But indeed, its benefits are for the solitary individual, for the reader alone. It will establish yourself. It will fortify yourself. It will sustain yourself. And also, I believe that it will go beyond what psychiatry can do for you or what religion necessarily can do for you. I mean, obviously, if one is in a profound clinical depression, which ultimately results from the body's bad or fatal chemistry, you require drugs to aid you to come out of the depression. But with other modes of depression, with other illnesses or sicknesses of the spirit, I think that the experienced reader, the deep reader, will discover that she is encountering the most healing of pleasures.
So what is the prospects for deep reading as you see them? What are they?
Well, on the mass level, it can look rather grim. But you know, Yaron, it is my experience, confirmed for me by recent book tours in Italy and in the United States on behalf of my latest book, How to Read and Why. Thousands of people, literally, whom I've never seen before, Italians and American, come up to me after I read from the book. I don't just sign books, I sit there for hours before and after a reading because I am a teacher. And I talk to people and I listen to them as closely as I can. And of course I can't deal with them, thousands of letters and email from all over the world. And while I'm heartened, it's also hopeless because I haven't got time and strength to deal with all of it. I have to rely upon people's goodwill and realizing that I can't reply to everything. But as I say, it heartens me because it seems to me that solitary, deep readers, that young women and young men with an overwhelming and authentic passion for reading, are born everywhere, at every moment, in every nation, that it is a deep human need, a deep human desire, perhaps even a fundamental human type, which is eternal, which will not be washed away by any technology.
But reading has run its course. I mean, mass reading is a couple of centuries old, the ability for many people to read many books. And of course, reading will stay. It's not going to disappear, but its impact on society might change. I mean, it's the weighted importance of it in our...
Well, I'm glad you bring that up. This is almost the last thing I would have strength to say at the moment, but I think it's the most important thing. The ability to think clearly and accurately and responsibly is really dependent upon memory, much more than most people realize much of the time. You cannot think well unless your memory is powerfully stored. If your memory has in it large repositories of the best that has indeed been thought and written and said, then you will think better and you will think more clearly. Democracy, whether in Sweden or the United States or any other society, depends overwhelmingly upon the individual citizen being able to think and feel clearly for herself or himself, and to be resistant to demagoguery. I would be very worried about the future of democracy in Sweden and the United States if indeed some continuity of deep reading does not endure among at least a crucial minority of their citizens.